Power rarely announces itself as power. When control is obvious, it is usually already failing. The systems that last do not rely on force. They rely on something quieter, something people accept without noticing. Most of the time, power does not tell you what to do. It shows you what feels normal. Symbols do most of that work. They shape perception before a decision is ever made. They make obedience feel voluntary. When symbols are effective, control no longer needs to be enforced. It becomes self-maintaining. And once that happens, power can disappear into the background. Not because it is gone, but because it no longer needs to be seen. When people think about power, they usually imagine something direct: commands being issued, rules being enforced, consequences made clear. Power, in this view, is something external. It acts on people from the outside. Someone decides, someone obeys. This understanding is not wrong. It is just incomplete. Force has always existed as a tool of control. So have laws, punishments, and authority figures. But these are not the most stable forms of power. They are expensive. They create resistance, and they require constant maintenance. Systems that rely only on force tend to expose themselves quickly. They become visible. They attract opposition. They fracture under pressure. This is why lasting power rarely depends on confrontation. Instead, it focuses on shaping expectations. It defines what behavior looks reasonable, what reactions seem appropriate, what outcomes feel inevitable. When expectations are shaped successfully, behavior follows without conflict. People move in the direction of power without feeling pushed. From the inside, this feels like choice. From the outside, it looks like order. This is the version of power most people live inside every day. Not the dramatic version portrayed in history books or films, but the quiet version that operates through norms, routines, and shared assumptions. It does not announce itself. It does not threaten. It blends into daily life. Because of this, it often goes unnoticed. People rarely ask how certain behaviors became normal, why some ideas feel obvious, why some questions feel inappropriate, why some roles are accepted without discussion. These are not accidents. They are the result of long-term influence operating below conscious awareness. To understand how this works, it helps to look past individual decisions and focus on the structures that guide them. Not the people issuing commands, but the systems shaping perception. Not what is enforced, but what is expected. This is where symbols enter. Symbols translate abstract power into something that feels natural. They turn structure into culture. They allow influence to persist without force. Once that happens, control no longer needs to be asserted. It is simply assumed. Most people think power operates through commands, orders, laws, threats, punishment. Those exist, but they are not the primary mechanism. In stable systems, power does not need to issue constant instructions. It shapes the environment instead. It establishes symbols that define what is respectable, what is normal, and what is unthinkable. Once those symbols are in place, behavior follows without resistance. This is why long-lasting institutions focus less on enforcement and more on representation. Flags, titles, ceremonies, architecture, language. None of these force action directly. They frame reality. When people internalize the frame, compliance feels like choice. Consider how authority is presented. Uniforms are not practical necessities. They are visual shortcuts. They signal legitimacy before a word is spoken. A uniform does not make someone powerful. It makes others assume power exists. That assumption changes behavior immediately. Posture shifts. tone changes, obedience appears without instruction. The symbol does the work first. This same principle applies to language. Titles like expert, official, or leader do not describe competence. They pre-authorize trust. Once a label is accepted, scrutiny decreases. Ideas are no longer evaluated on their content. They are accepted based on their source. This is one of the most efficient mechanisms of control. It reduces resistance without confrontation. Symbols are especially effective because they operate below conscious awareness. People rarely say, "I am obeying this symbol." They say, "This is just how things are." That sentence is the real indicator. When something feels inevitable, power has already succeeded. Take architecture. Large buildings with high ceilings, rigid symmetry, and elevated platforms are not neutral design choices. They create psychological distance. They make individuals feel small in relation to the institution. This does not require intimidation. It simply establishes hierarchy through space. The body responds before the mind does. Symbols work best when they are everywhere and unnoticed. The moment a symbol becomes obvious, it risks being questioned. Effective power prefers familiarity over force. This is why repetition matters. The same imagery, the same phrasing, the same rituals. Over time, repetition becomes reality. Once a symbol is internalized, it no longer feels external. People begin to enforce it on themselves. They self-correct. They self-censor. They align without being told to. At that point, power becomes efficient. It no longer needs to act. It only needs to remain consistent. This is also why systems resist change at the symbolic level more than at the policy level. Rules can be rewritten. Symbols are harder to replace. Changing a symbol threatens the structure beneath it. That is why challenges to symbols often provoke stronger reactions than challenges to decisions. The response is not logical. It is defensive. The system senses instability. When symbols fail, power is forced to reveal itself. That is when enforcement increases. That is when control becomes visible. And visibility is a sign of weakness. Strong power is quiet. It blends into culture. It feels natural. It feels earned. By the time people notice it, it has already shaped their options. This is the foundation of symbolic control. Not domination through fear, but alignment through perception. Once perception is shaped, behavior follows. And once behavior follows, power no longer needs to speak. Recognizing symbolic influence does not require suspicion. In fact, suspicion makes recognition harder. When people begin looking for manipulation everywhere, they stop seeing structure clearly. They replace analysis with reaction. Effective recognition is quieter than that. It starts with noticing patterns, not intentions. Symbols do not need malicious intent to be effective. Most systems are not designed by villains. They are shaped by incentives, tradition, and repetition. That is what makes them stable. So the goal is not to uncover hidden enemies. The goal is to observe how perception is guided. The simplest place to start is with emotional consistency. Ask what emotions are being reinforced over time. Calm, urgency, fear, reverence, trust. Symbols tend to stabilize one emotional state and discourage others. When an environment consistently produces the same emotional response, that response is being cultivated. This applies to media, institutions, and social spaces, not through direct instruction, but through atmosphere. Next, notice what feels out of bounds. Every system has topics that feel uncomfortable to question. Not illegal, not forbidden, just socially discouraged. Those boundaries are often symbolic rather than rational. They are protected by tone, not argument. Statements like, "That's just how it is," or "Everyone knows that," signal symbolic closure. They end discussion without explanation. That does not mean the system is wrong, but it does mean the symbol is doing protective work. Another indicator is disproportionate reaction. When a small symbolic challenge produces a strong emotional response, something deeper is being defended. Symbols often carry meaning far beyond their practical role. They represent continuity, stability, identity. That is why challenges to symbols feel personal, even when they are abstract. Recognition also involves timing. Pay attention to when symbols are emphasized. During uncertainty, symbols become louder. During instability, rituals increase. During transition, repetition intensifies. This is not accidental. Symbols help systems maintain coherence when outcomes are uncertain. They reassure without resolving anything. That reassurance reduces anxiety, which reduces resistance. This is not inherently negative. All societies rely on symbolic cohesion. The danger arises when symbols are treated as substitutes for reality rather than guides through it. When symbols become untouchable, adaptation slows. When questioning symbols is framed as disloyalty, complexity disappears. At the individual level, recognition means creating a small distance between perception and reaction, not rejecting symbols outright, not accepting them automatically, but observing how they influence behavior. Ask simple questions. What behavior does this symbol encourage? What behavior does it discourage? Who benefits from its stability? Who is constrained by it? These questions do not require confrontation. They require patience. Symbolic systems do not collapse under pressure. They erode under clarity. Once a symbol is seen as a mechanism rather than a truth, its influence changes. It does not vanish, but it becomes contextual. It becomes optional. That is the difference between being controlled and being informed. Recognition does not remove power. It rebalances it. Power always exists. The question is whether it operates invisibly or transparently. Symbols will always shape perception. The task is not to escape them. The task is to see them clearly enough to choose how much influence they hold. That awareness is subtle. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. But once it forms, it changes how systems feel. They become structures instead of inevitabilities. And that shift is enough to restore agency. People do not defend symbolic systems because they are deceived. They defend them because those systems provide coherence. Symbols do more than guide behavior. They organize identity. When a symbol is internalized, it becomes part of how a person understands themselves. Questioning the symbol then feels like questioning the self. This is why symbolic defense is often emotional rather than logical. It is not about the idea being challenged. It is about what the idea supports: belonging, stability, meaning. Symbolic systems offer a sense of orientation. They answer questions most people do not want to confront directly. Who am I? Where do I fit? What matters? When a symbol provides those answers, it becomes protective. Even if the system creates limitations, it also reduces uncertainty. For many people, that trade-off feels acceptable. This is especially true in complex environments. As systems grow larger and more abstract, individuals rely more heavily on symbols to navigate them. Rules become too numerous to track. Outcomes become harder to predict. Symbols simplify. They compress complexity into something manageable. Once that compression is accepted, it becomes efficient. Identity then forms around alignment. I am the kind of person who believes this. I am the kind of person who respects that. I am not the kind of person who questions this. These distinctions feel personal, but they are socially reinforced. Agreement becomes a signal of belonging. Dissent becomes a signal of risk. Over time, people begin to defend symbols preemptively, not because they are threatened directly, but because instability feels dangerous. This is why symbolic challenges are often framed as moral failures, rather than analytical disagreements. The system does not argue its case. It questions the challenge's legitimacy. Once identity is involved, rational discussion becomes difficult. The goal shifts from understanding to preservation. This does not require coercion. Social pressure is usually sufficient. Approval, disapproval, silence. These signals guide behavior more effectively than force. People adjust to maintain alignment. They adopt the language. They repeat the rituals. They defend the symbol, even when it restricts them. This is not irrational. It is adaptive within the system. Identity-based defense reduces cognitive load. It provides certainty. It offers a stable narrative, but it also creates rigidity. When identity and symbol become inseparable, change feels like loss. That is why symbolic reform is slow. Policies can be updated quickly. Beliefs cannot. The deeper a symbol is tied to identity, the more resistance it generates. This is also why power rarely attacks identity directly. It aligns with it. It presents itself as natural, as familiar, as already agreed upon. Once that alignment is established, enforcement becomes unnecessary. People protect the system because it feels like protecting themselves. Understanding this dynamic changes how resistance works. Direct confrontation strengthens symbolic attachment. Ridicule hardens it. Force validates it. Effective change does not attack identity. It introduces alternatives. It allows distance. It makes new symbols available without demanding immediate rejection of the old ones. This is slower, but it is more stable. Identity shifts gradually. Symbols lose dominance not when they are destroyed, but when they are no longer required. When people find meaning elsewhere, control loosens naturally. This is why the most enduring systems are those that evolve symbolically. They adapt without appearing to change. They preserve continuity while adjusting influence. Power that understands identity rarely needs to assert itself. It waits. And that patience is itself a mechanism. Modern systems do not rely on new symbols. They rely on faster repetition. The symbols themselves are often familiar. What has changed is the speed at which they circulate. Media compresses time. It shortens the distance between exposure and reinforcement. When symbols are repeated rapidly, they bypass reflection. They feel present everywhere at once. This creates the impression of consensus, not because agreement has been reached, but because alternatives have less time to form. Speed favors familiarity. The more often a symbol appears, the less effort it takes to accept. Over time, repetition becomes indistinguishable from reality. This is why modern influence rarely feels imposed. It feels ambient. Symbols appear across platforms, contexts, and tones: serious, casual, ironic, emotional. Each appearance reinforces the last. The symbol does not argue. It accumulates. This accumulation creates psychological gravity. Ideas repeated frequently feel safer than ideas encountered rarely, not because they are better, but because they are known. Familiarity reduces uncertainty. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, so the mind gravitates toward what it recognizes. Modern systems amplify this effect by removing pauses. There is little space between exposure and response, little time for evaluation, little opportunity for symbols to lose momentum. The faster the cycle, the less resistance forms. This does not require centralized control. Algorithms optimize for engagement, not ideology, but engagement favors emotional consistency. Content that reinforces existing symbols performs better than content that destabilizes them. As a result, symbolic patterns intensify without deliberate coordination. The system rewards what maintains coherence. Speed also changes how symbols are defended. When challenges arise, responses are immediate. There is no reflection period. Reaction replaces analysis. Defense becomes reflexive. This makes symbolic systems feel more rigid than they actually are. The rigidity is not structural, it is temporal. Slowing down changes the effect. When repetition decreases, symbols lose urgency. When urgency fades, evaluation returns. This is why long-form analysis feels disruptive. It reintroduces time. Time weakens symbolic pressure. It allows ideas to be examined rather than absorbed. This is also why rapid cycles discourage depth. Depth interrupts flow. Flow maintains influence. Modern symbolic control depends on continuity. Not continuity of logic, but continuity of exposure. Break the continuity, and the symbol becomes visible again. Once visible, it becomes optional. This does not dismantle systems. It changes how they are experienced. People regain a sense of distance. That distance is enough to restore perspective. Speed collapses perception. Slowness expands it. Modern power understands this. That is why it accelerates. That is why it prefers immediacy. That is why silence feels uncomfortable. Silence creates space, and space allows symbols to be seen for what they are. Mechanisms, not truths. Power rarely needs to announce itself. When symbols work, control no longer has to speak. It settles into habits, into language, into what feels ordinary. Over time, influence becomes invisible, not because it is weak, but because it is familiar. What shapes behavior most effectively is not force, but framing, not commands, but context. Symbols do not tell people what to think. They tell people what to expect. Once expectations are set, choices narrow quietly. Nothing has to be enforced. Nothing has to be defended. The system simply continues. Awareness does not destroy this process. It changes how it is experienced. When symbols are seen as mechanisms rather than truths, their influence softens. They remain present, but they no longer decide in advance. Power still exists. It always will. The difference is whether it operates unseen or whether it is recognized for what it is. And recognition, even when silent, is enough to change the shape of control.